What if the first great financial scam in history was not created by the names everyone knows, but by a forgotten family whose influence quietly rewired how money, trust, and power operated centuries before modern banking existed? Imagine hearing that the blueprint for manipulation, speculation, and monetary control that dominates global markets today did not begin with the Rothschilds, but with a dynasty so skilled in deception that even kings relied on them without understanding how deeply they were being played. This opening might feel unsettling, yet it is exactly this discomfort that reveals how financial history is built on layers of illusions, hidden incentives, and families who understood that controlling perception was more powerful than controlling gold itself. To grasp how this family engineered the first great financial scam, we need to step into a world where currency was fragile, information traveled slowly, and the few who mastered accounting and credit systems could bend economies in silence. Picture a marketplace where coins varied from city to city and where trust was the true currency. In this chaos, the family rose by offering stability, acting as intermediaries of exchange, guardians of deposits, and interpreters of value. But behind the scenes, they discovered a secret pattern. If you controlled the flow of information and the mechanisms of credit, you could influence entire kingdoms without ever lifting a sword. Their brilliance was not in brute force, but in anticipation. They understood human fear, the desire for security, and the blind confidence rulers placed in those who appeared indispensable. Little by little, their methods evolved from honest service to carefully orchestrated manipulation. They learned to inflate values, alter records, and exploit the gaps between what people believed and what was really happening. And as their influence grew, so did their appetite for crafting financial illusions that enriched them while destabilizing others. You might have already sensed how familiar this sounds. That is no coincidence. The techniques that dominate today's financial landscape have roots deeper than most imagine, and the story of this family exposes uncomfortable truths about how economic power is truly built. You ever felt like the system was designed for someone else, not for you? Stay with me, because what you are about to uncover may reshape how you see every crisis, every boom, and every so-called innovation in global finance. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if this topic resonates with you, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Your engagement helps bring more investigative content like this to light as we move deeper into the hidden architecture behind the first great financial deception, opening space for the next revelation that this story holds. The rise of this family did not happen through sudden brilliance, but through a patient accumulation of influence that no one around them recognized as dangerous. Their ascent began quietly, almost innocently, as they positioned themselves as reliable handlers of currency in a world that desperately needed stability. But what set them apart was not just their skill with money, it was their understanding that information was the true engine of power. In an era when news could take days or weeks to travel, they learned to turn every delay, every whisper, every discrepancy, into an opportunity to expand their control. They cultivated relationships with merchants, clergy, regional authorities, and even wandering traders. Each interaction offered them fragments of intelligence others considered trivial, yet they pieced these fragments together to forecast storms that no ruler or banker could see coming. When wars loomed, they shifted their assets. When crops failed, they bet against regions destined for collapse. And when new alliances formed, they became the quiet facilitators of financial arrangements that made them indispensable to both sides. This was not luck. It was strategic invisibility, a mastery of systems that allowed them to operate just below the threshold of suspicion. Their operations expanded as they realized that trust created leverage. The more people depended on them to certify the value of coins or mediate exchanges between cities, the more they could manipulate the perception of scarcity and abundance. They learned that a subtle adjustment to ledger books or the timing of a delivery could shift the economic fortunes of an entire region. As long as they appeared neutral and helpful, no one questioned how much influence they truly held. This illusion of honesty became their greatest weapon. Behind closed doors, they refined techniques that would later become foundations of modern finance. They created early forms of credit, encouraging elites to borrow more than they could repay. They managed deposits in a way that allowed them to lend the same funds multiple times, quietly multiplying their influence, while keeping creditors unaware of the risks. When their clients struggled, they offered solutions that deepened the dependence, ensuring that the family remained at the center of every critical decision. Their growing dominance was camouflaged by the complexity of the financial landscape. Most rulers were too distracted by territorial disputes and political rivalries to understand the mechanics of money, creation, and manipulation. This allowed the family to keep expanding without detection, shaping markets through techniques that would later be echoed in speculative bubbles, manipulated currencies, and credit systems that appeared legitimate on the surface but were built on layers of illusion. And so their influence spread silently, weaving itself into the foundations of early financial structures, preparing the stage for the moment when their methods would evolve from subtle manipulation into a massive, unstoppable force that reshaped the economies around them. As their network expanded across borders, the family began experimenting with techniques that allowed them to influence entire regions without leaving any visible trace. And what made their system so effective was its adaptability. They realized early on that every city, every ruler, and every economy had its own weaknesses. Some territories were plagued by unstable coinage, others by chronic debt, others by political turmoil. Instead of offering uniform services, the family created tailored financial mechanisms that exploited each vulnerability with surgical precision. This flexibility became the secret behind their growing dominance. One of the methods they perfected was the manipulation of exchange rates between cities. In a fragmented monetary world, the value of coins fluctuated wildly, creating constant confusion. The family used this to their advantage, quietly adjusting the rates they offered depending on their goals. They could undervalue or overvalue certain currencies, creating artificial shortages or sudden inflations that they alone were prepared to navigate. To the public, these fluctuations seemed like natural consequences of markets, but in reality, they were calculated moves designed to generate profit and extend influence. Another hidden advantage was their understanding of timing. They learned when to release funds and when to withhold them, using liquidity as a weapon. If a region faced instability, they restricted access to capital, making themselves the only reliable source of emergency credit. When prosperity returned, they loosened their grip, appearing generous and indispensable. This rhythmic control over money flow is one of the earliest examples of financial engineering, centuries before the term existed. And it worked because no one at the time had the expertise to detect how deeply they were shaping the economic landscape. Meanwhile, the family's ledger books became tools of manipulation rather than simple records. They discovered that information asymmetry gave them the power to redefine value. By overstating deposits, understating liabilities, or altering the order of transactions, they could craft financial realities that benefited them at the expense of everyone else. These falsifications were subtle enough to avoid suspicion, yet impactful enough to influence decisions made by merchants, nobles, and rulers alike. Their ledgers became the invisible architecture of power, the mechanism through which economic truth could be rewritten. As their methods evolved, their reputation for reliability paradoxically strengthened. The more tangled the financial environment became, the more people trusted the family to bring clarity. They positioned themselves as guardians of monetary stability while quietly exploiting the confusion they helped create. Their operations began to resemble a prototype of modern banking systems, complete with hidden leverage, structured manipulation, and a growing dependency from clients who believed they had no alternative. But beneath this facade of stability, their actions were planting the seeds of an unprecedented financial storm. The contradictions at the heart of their system, the layers of deceit built upon fragile trust, and the expanding network of borrowers who depended on credit created an environment primed for collapse. What began as minor manipulations was slowly becoming a mechanism, too large to control, setting the stage for the moment when their strategies would spiral into the first massive financial scam the world had ever seen. The turning point arrived when the family realized that their influence had grown far beyond what the political and economic structures around them could contain. What began as subtle control over exchange rates and credit quietly evolved into a full-scale mechanism capable of shifting the economic fate of entire kingdoms. With each passing year, they moved from responding to crises to engineering them. A drought, a regional conflict, or a shortage of coinage became more than events to navigate. They became tools. The family discovered that by strategically tightening or expanding credit at key moments, they could force rulers into decisions that aligned perfectly with their financial ambitions. Their greatest weapon was the illusion of necessity. By positioning themselves as the only institution capable of stabilizing markets, during uncertainty they created cycles where fear amplified their power. When local treasuries faced deficits, the family stepped in with loans that seemed generous, but were designed to entangle rulers in webs of dependence. Interest rates were manipulated. Collateral was demanded under the guise of protection, and repayment structures were intentionally complex. Each agreement added another layer of quiet domination, invisible to the public and barely understood even by the elites who signed them. As their operations expanded, the cracks in their system grew deeper. The family became increasingly bold, creating new financial instruments that magnified their reach but introduced immense fragility. They issued overlapping loans backed by the same funds, assured borrowers that risks were minimal, and used misinformation to maintain confidence where none should have existed. Yet, despite the dangerous architecture forming beneath the surface, admiration for their reliability continued to grow. Rulers celebrated their expertise, nobles praised their stability, and merchants depended on their guarantees. No one realized that the foundation of this admiration was built on shifting sand. The moment the scam became unstoppable was when they began circulating promises of payment that exceeded the actual reserves they controlled. They had created a system where debts fed other debts, credit sustained credit, and confidence replaced real assets. As long as people believed in the value of the notes they issued, the system expanded. But any disruption, any sudden demand for withdrawals would reveal the truth. The wealth they projected was far greater than the wealth they actually possessed. This imbalance marked the beginning of the largest financial illusion the era had seen, a force growing so rapidly that even the family themselves struggled to keep up with the consequences of their creation. What no one understood at the time was that they had invented a prototype, of fractional banking long before the idea had a name. And that innovation, though brilliant, carried within it the spark of collapse. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part of this emerging pattern seems the most surprising or unsettling to you. Your perspective helps bring depth to this investigation as we continue exploring the hidden layers of this financial deception. Kings and nobles, despite their authority, had little understanding of how money truly flowed through their own territories. This ignorance made them the perfect targets for the family's growing network of illusions. While rulers focused on wars, alliances, and political rivalries, the family operated underneath the surface, controlling the invisible machinery that kept those kingdoms functioning. When a ruler believed he was securing funds to strengthen his power, he was often walking directly into financial traps designed to bind him to the family's interests. The brilliance of the strategy was its subtlety. Nothing appeared coercive. From the outside, it looked like cooperation, expertise, and mutual benefit. One of the most cunning tools the family used was the restructuring of royal debt. They approached rulers with proposals that seemed like salvation, a chance to reorganize burdensome loans, stabilize treasuries, and restore confidence. But the terms were always crafted to favor the family. They extended loan maturities to create long-term dependency, inserted clauses that allowed them to seize assets in times of crisis, and demanded exclusive rights to manage certain revenues. In doing so, they transformed temporary assistance into permanent leverage. Equally manipulative was their role as intermediaries in negotiations between rulers. Whenever two kingdoms faced disputes, the family offered to mediate financial agreements, providing guarantees that both sides trusted. This gave them unparalleled access to the strategic plans and vulnerabilities of multiple territories. With every treaty they shaped, they gained deeper insight into military capabilities, economic limitations, and political fractures. These insights were converted into opportunities to expand their influence, often at the expense of the very rulers who believed they were being helped. Merchants who sought favor with royalty quickly learned that aligning with the family was the fastest way to gain access to court privileges. As a result, the family became gatekeepers to economic opportunity. They manipulated trade flows, influenced taxation policies, and orchestrated shortages or surpluses in key markets. Their reach extended far beyond coins and ledgers. They shaped the commercial arteries of entire regions, deciding which industries prospered and which collapsed. The most remarkable part is how blind the elites were to the growing danger. The family's operations were wrapped in a facade of competence and generosity. Rulers admired them for their efficiency, nobles trusted them for their reliability, and merchants worshipped them for their ability to create wealth. No one recognized the pattern unfolding right in front of them, a slow, deliberate consolidation of power that would eventually overshadow the authority of crowns themselves. But the more the family expanded, the more fragile the system became. They were balancing layers of loans, promises, and fabricated valuations that depended entirely on continued faith. The slightest tremor, a delayed payment, a failed harvest, or military defeat could trigger a chain reaction that revealed the deception beneath the surface. And as their empire grew more complex, that moment was inching closer, hidden beneath the appearance of prosperity and control. The impact of the family's expanding operations began to spill far beyond the courts and markets they directly controlled. Their financial architecture, built on layered credit, manipulated valuations, and carefully crafted illusions of stability, started to reshape entire continents. Regions that had once operated independently found themselves indirectly connected through invisible chains of debt and dependency. Local economies rose or fell based on decisions made in the family's private chambers, decisions influenced not by national priorities, but by the pursuit of profit and influence. Without ever holding political office, they had become one of the most powerful forces shaping geopolitical outcomes. Merchants began timing their voyages, according to the family's predictions. Nobles adjusted their estates based on the fluctuations the family engineered. Rulers launched campaigns or retreated from conflicts depending on the credit extended to them. Slowly, the family became the silent pulse behind major events, orchestrating liquidity in ways that directed the flow of history. When a region prospered, people praised the wisdom of its leaders, unaware that its stability often came from deliberate injections of credit designed to secure long-term leverage. When a region collapsed, the blame fell on political incompetence or misfortune, never on the hidden financial mechanisms that had drained its reserves and tightened its vulnerabilities. Their influence reached trade routes, shaping the movement of goods that entire populations relied on. When the family wanted to weaken a region, they redirected capital away from it, causing shortages, slowed commerce, and rising prices. Conversely, regions they wished to strengthen benefited from sudden access to funds, rapid expansion of trade, and artificially boosted markets. These fluctuations seemed organic to observers, but they were part of a deliberate pattern, a calculated design that let the family re-engineer economic landscapes to maintain control without displaying overt authority. One of the most profound impacts was the transformation of public trust. People no longer placed their confidence in coins or rulers alone, but in the documents, seals, and assurances issued by the family. Their letters of credit became more valuable than local currency. Their assessments of value were treated as absolute truth. They had, without fanfare, replaced traditional symbols of stability with their own. This shift altered how societies understood wealth itself, encouraging new forms of speculation, dependence, and risk-taking that mirrored the deeper instability of the system. By this stage, the family's influence was no longer confined to finances. It had become cultural, psychological, and structural. People adapted their lives around the rhythms the family created, unaware that these rhythms were guided by hidden incentives and fragile foundations. Yet beneath this vast network of influence, something dangerous was growing. The more the family expanded, the thinner their real reserves became. They were balancing an empire of obligations on a platform that required perfect confidence to survive. In the shadows of prosperity, the tension, built silently, waiting for the moment when all the contradictions woven into their system would erupt into consequences no one was prepared to confront. As the family's influence continued to expand, the cracks within their own system began to widen. They had built an empire on confidence, secrecy, and intricate financial engineering. But these same elements now turned into sources of volatility they could no longer fully control. Their network had grown so vast that even minor disruptions could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Loans layered on top of loans created a maze of obligations that required flawless execution. A single late payment by a distant noble, a shipment of coin intercepted by bandits, or a sudden shift in political alliances could destabilize an entire chain of credit. And as their obligations multiplied, these dangers multiplied with them. Behind closed doors, the family grew increasingly aware of the fragility of their position. They held more promises than actual reserves, more influence than the system could realistically support. Their ledgers were meticulously crafted illusions that depended on perfect timing and absolute faith from their clients. When rumors spread of instability in one territory, they rushed to create reassurances, issuing letters, dispatching envoys, and manufacturing confidence to prevent the slightest doubt from taking hold. They knew that perception could trigger collapse faster than any economic weakness. To maintain stability, they developed desperate tactics. They restructured debts quietly, shifting obligations between regions to mask shortfalls. They pressured certain nobles to repay early while encouraging others to delay, manipulating the flow of money to cover gaps in their books. At the same time, they tightened control over access to credit, choosing winners and losers based on who could help sustain the illusion for another month, another season, another year. Their manipulations grew, more aggressive, while their outward appearance remained polished, disciplined, and reassuring. Yet, even their mastery could not fully contain the expanding tensions. Some rulers began questioning why their treasuries remained unstable despite constant restructuring. Merchants noticed contradictions between the family's assurances and the realities of markets. A few advisors whispered concerns about the family's power, wondering how an institution with no army, no territory could wield influence greater than the throne itself. These doubts were small at first, but they spread quietly, just like the family's original rise. The family sensed the shift. They recognized the signs of a looming reckoning, the type of collapse that could expose the very mechanisms they had spent generations perfecting. Their empire was still holding, but the pressure was mounting from all sides, creating a silent countdown that no manipulation could fully reset. And as the tension escalated, the Singh family found themselves fighting to preserve not just their wealth, but the illusion that had made their dominance possible in the first place. Share in the comments what part of this growing tension you found the most revealing. Your perspective helps unfold the hidden dynamics of this story as we continue exploring the forces that push this financial empire toward its inevitable breaking point. The The collapse did not begin with a dramatic event. It started quietly, almost invisibly, as the first signs of strain appeared within the family's own network. Their empire had grown so dependent on flawless synchronization that even minor delays produced waves of instability. A regional treasury that postponed repayment by a few weeks triggered liquidity shortages elsewhere. A noble's failed harvest reduced tax revenues, weakening the collateral that supported several interconnected loans. These tremors were small in isolation, but the system had become so interconnected that every imbalance created pressure somewhere else, stretching the web of obligations thinner and thinner. As these cracks widened, the family attempted to mask the instability by creating even more complex instruments. They issued new promises backed by older promises, circulating layers of debt that looked solid on the surface but had little substance beneath. To those who relied on their assurances, nothing seemed amiss. Letters of credit continued to flow. Trade routes operated under their guidance. Markets functioned as if supported by genuine strength. But beneath the polished exterior, the financial structure was becoming dangerously unstable, supported more by perception than by actual reserves. The spiral accelerated when a series of unexpected events converged. A border conflict disrupted trade routes that the family relied on to move coin between territories. A sudden shift in political alliances caused a major client to delay repayment, citing uncertainty. Merchant guilds and another region faced shortages due to altered supply chains, decreasing the flow of fees the family expected. Each of these events was manageable on its own, but together they created a storm that the family's engineered system was not designed to withstand. Their network required constant, smooth circulation of funds, and now that circulation was faltering. The family responded with their usual precision, but something had changed. The scale of the crisis exceeded the tools they had used for generations. They tried to reallocate assets, but too many regions demanded liquidity at once. They attempted to stall repayments, but creditors grew impatient. They issued reassurances, but advisors close to the rulers began questioning why such reassurances were necessary in the first place. Confidence, the invisible foundation of their power, began to erode, not through revolt or confrontation, but through quiet doubt. As confidence weakened, the fragility of their system became impossible to hide. Merchants who had once trusted their guarantees now hesitated. Nobles who depended on their letters of credit began demanding hard currency instead. Rulers who had long accepted their advice started investigating the true state of their accounts. These subtle shifts created a feedback loop in which doubt generated instability, and instability generated deeper doubt. The family's once flawless machinery was now misfiring in multiple places at once. The collapse had not fully arrived, but its shadow stretched across every region touched by their influence. And as the demands for transparency grew louder, the family understood that revealing the true condition of their books would not only destroy their empire, but also expose the hidden mechanisms that had quietly shaped economies for decades. As the truth began to surface, something even more revealing emerged. The blueprint that this family created did not vanish with their decline. Instead, it survived, adapted, and eventually became woven into the financial systems that shaped the modern world. The mechanisms they pioneered, leveraged credit, artificial liquidity, strategic information control, confidence-based financial instruments, did not die out. They evolved. And in that evolution lies one of the most important patterns in economic history. Fraud rarely disappears. It mutates into legitimacy. Many of the tools they invented in secrecy later reappeared as accepted practices. Their early form of credit, expansion, became the foundation of modern lending. Their manipulation of exchange rates anticipated the speculative tactics used centuries later by powerful banking houses. Even their practice of issuing more promises than actual reserves foreshadowed fractional reserve banking, a system now considered normal despite its inherent fragility. The world learned to call these mechanisms innovation, but their origin was rooted in the same strategies that nearly collapsed entire regions during the Aspe family's reign. The fascinating part is how these patterns repeat themselves across eras. Every major financial crisis in modern history echoes the same structural weaknesses: overextended credit, inflated valuations, dependence on confidence rather than real assets, and institutions that grow too interconnected to fail without triggering chain reactions. While each generation believes its crisis is unique, the underlying architecture remains hauntingly familiar. This resemblance is not coincidence. It is the direct consequence of frameworks created centuries ago, long before global banks and international markets existed. As scholars later studied the collapse of this early financial empire, they realized how deeply its methods had influenced future systems. Some argued that the family had unintentionally written the manual for economic manipulation. Others believed that later banking dynasties simply recognized the efficiency of these tactics and refined them. Whatever the interpretation, The similarity is undeniable. The same dynamics that once empowered a single family now underpin mechanisms used by powerful institutions, central banks, and global markets. The most striking parallel lies in the reliance on perception. Just as the family's empire survived only as long as people believed in the value of their promises, modern systems operate on confidence, trust, and the assumption that institutions are stable. When that faith weakens, markets tremble, currencies collapse, and governments intervene to prevent systemic breakdowns. The ghost of the original scam still lingers, shaping decisions at the highest levels of global finance. Through this pattern, history reveals an uncomfortable truth. The line between innovation and deception is thinner than most realize. Many of the financial tools celebrated today carry the DNA of strategies once used to manipulate entire kingdoms. And while the world has grown more sophisticated, the underlying forces, fear, trust, control of information, and the pursuit of influence remain as powerful as ever. The family's legacy, though buried in time, continues to echo through every credit bubble, every market panic, and every crisis born from the illusion that systems built on fragile foundations can endure indefinitely. As the full collapse unfolded, the family found themselves trapped inside the very machine they had created. The same mechanisms that once brought them unprecedented power now turned against them with relentless speed. Confidence evaporated. Merchants demanded physical payment. Nobles withdrew their alliances. Rulers who had once praised the family's expertise now questioned their integrity and demanded explanations that could not be given without revealing the fragile architecture beneath their empire. What had been a fortress of influence suddenly looked like a hollow structure held together by promises no longer believed. The collapse did not happen in a single moment, but rather through a series of accelerating failures. One region's refusal to honor a loan triggered panic among others. Delayed repayments spread like shockwaves across territories. Letters of credit were rejected, not because their terms had changed, but because trust, the invisible foundation of every financial system, had dissolved. Each rejection pushed the family closer to exposure, revealing that much of the wealth they claimed to possess existed only on ledgers designed to hide the gaps. Their carefully architected system, once praised for its brilliance, had become a labyrinth no one could navigate safely anymore. As their empire unraveled, the repercussions spread outward, shaking economies that had become dependent on their operations. Trade routes slowed as uncertainty grew. Local markets faced extreme fluctuations as liquidity vanished. Rulers struggled to rebuild their treasuries without the stabilizing presence the family once provided. It became clear that the family's downfall was not just a private catastrophe, it was a systemic event that revealed how deeply intertwined their methods had become with regional economies. Their influence had permeated everything, and now that influence collapsed like a structure built on shifting sand. Yet the most fascinating aspect of this downfall is how little people learned from it. Instead of abandoning the mechanisms that caused the crisis, later generations repackaged them with new names, new structures, and new institutions. What collapsed as fraud was later revived as innovation. What once destabilized kingdoms eventually became celebrated as the foundation of global finance. The family's legacy survived, not in their name, but in the architecture of systems that still operate today, systems built on leverage, speculation, and the constant balancing of confidence and risk. And so, as we look back on the first great financial scam, the question is not how a single family could create such a system, but how that system became the blueprint for everything that followed. Their story is more than a historical event. It is a mirror reflecting the recurring patterns that shape economies across centuries. And understanding those patterns is what allows us to see the present more clearly, recognizing that many of the forces driving modern finance were born long before anyone realized how powerful they would become. If you reach this point, tell me in the comments with the phrase, "This message was for me." Your insight helps deepen this exploration and keeps this investigation alive. If the content brought clarity or made you rethink how financial power works, consider subscribing to the channel so you stay connected to stories that reveal what usually remains hidden. Leave a like if the narrative resonated with you, and there's another video here on the side that continues this line of thought. Click and follow the thread of this history with me as we move into the next chapter of how hidden forces have shaped the world we know today.